Good evening and welcome to the British School at Rome. Tonight's talk is the second in the City of Rome course series, a programme of public lectures accompanying our annual postgraduate course on the archaeology and topography of ancient Rome. It is a cliché and an often unwarranted one to claim that a speaker needs no introduction, but in the context of this specific lecture series this evening, it rings true. Dr. Robert Coates-Stephens is the Cary Fellow at the British School at Rome, and from 2002 to 2023 was the director of the postgraduate course, as well as co-director of the BSR undergraduate summer school. For hundreds of students at British universities, Robert's unrivaled knowledge of ancient Rome and unique brand of humour about it has been their introduction to the history and topography of the city. His insistence on focusing on actual evidence has impressed upon and reassured 2 decades of students that it is okay to eschew following every theory, trend, or turn when attempting to understand the ancient city. When university bosses might idly muse on words such as impact or legacy, they would do well to look at and be envious of the record of the students who attended the course under Robert's tutelage, dozens of who have subsequently pursued academic and related field careers. It is surely not a coincidence that much of the research carried out by City of Rome course alumni focuses on ancient Italy and Rome, often generated by the work they began when studying here at the school. This year's cohort of students have continued to benefit from Robert's expertise, and yesterday he led us around Regio III and underneath the church of San Clemente. This means that the group is now well prepped for the subject of this evening talk, although it also has the added bonus for Robert that it is his interpretation of the site that they are well versed in. Robert has published widely on Rome, in particular on the late antique and early medieval city. His many articles on spolia are well known, and his most recent chapter, The Colossus of Nero and the Pantheon in Chronicle Tradition, published in the volume In Memory of Amanda Claridge, draws on the underutilized Byzantine sources to shed light on earlier developments in the capital, including about the enigmatic Domitianic Pantheon. Robert's 2004 monograph, Porta Maggiore, Monument and Landscape, Archaeology and Topography of the Southern Esquiline from the late Republican period to the present day, published with Lerma Debret Schneider, remains the definitive work on that part of the city. In 2014, Robert also edited the volume Scritti in Onore di Lucas Cozza, and for the last several years has been working on a new book about the collection of Lateran bronzes and what happened to the bronze sculpture of antiquity more broadly. This research took him to Istanbul, where he held a senior fellowship at Amamed, the Research Centre for Anatolian Studies, in 2018-19. I am told that the book is now complete and we can look forward to it being published soon. Switching from statues to buildings, this evening's talk is titled House Museums in Ancient Rome and the Memoria of Clement. It is my very great pleasure to introduce, and will you please welcome Robert Coates-Stephens.
Thanks very much, Chris, for those kind words. Roman aristocrats were extremely interested in the genealogy of their houses. Thanks to the almost obsessive recording of such authors as Nepos, Asconius, Suetonius, and of course Cicero, scholars have been able to draw up elaborate family trees showing the passage of an individual Roman domus from one owner to another, most famously that of Cicero himself, included here in Andrea Carandini's instructive schema, together with several other prominent examples. Scholarly interest in this question has concentrated on the best evidenced cases from the Republic. Apart from Cicero and Clodius here in the drawing, we know of the intricate real estate vicissitudes of the properties of Atticus, Scaurus, and Mark Antony, to name just a few. For the early empire, attention is focused on the houses of the imperial household, most famously of Augustus himself, whose various properties boasted such eminent former owners as Hortensius, Lutatius Catulus, the orator Calvus, Marcius Philippus, and Maecenas. Occasionally, the texts allow us to follow some venerable houses into late antiquity. The classic case is Pompey's Domus Rostrata on the Oppian Hill, said by the late 4th century author of the Historia Augusta to be standing still in his day. Long after Cicero's outrage at its sale to Mark Antony, we hear that Antony's heirs, the Gordians, still occupied the Ides 300 years later. And here we see San Pietro in Vincoli, beneath which Domenico Palombi suggests we might locate the house in question. And we also see some of the pavements under the church with former City of Rome students' feet. During these passages of ownership, some houses remain virtually unchanged in their physical aspect. Atticus inherited the house of the 2nd century consul Tamphilus on the Quirinal from his uncle, and according to Nepos, he made no alteration in it except such as he was obliged to make by the effects of time. Pliny's famous description of the atria of the Maiores, with their wax family portraits arranged in order in cupboards and painted family trees, states that the spoils won by past family members in their military campaigns were exhibited outside the tablinum, and that by law, they had to remain in the house even after it was sold. He draws the intriguing conclusion that in this way, the houses continued to triumph even after changing owner. And this seems to be confirmed by the aforementioned Domus Rostrata of Pompey, which famously took its name from the ship's rostra fixed in its atrium. And here, standing in for such textual examples, is the great atrium of Pompey's house of Menander, seen from the tablinum, but no triumphal spoils. Other houses, however, were transformed, sometimes radically. When Scaurus bought the house of the Octavii on the Palatine near the Via Sacra, he added to its atrium 4 38-foot Lucullan marble columns that he had first exhibited at his lavish temporary theatre. And this was the house that was later owned by Clodius, and in Asconius's day, it belonged to the consul of 42 AD, Largus Caecina. No such enormous columns are known in any ancient house today. These to the right from Delos might be about 18 to 20 foot, and the frescoes from Oplontis to the left give some idea of the impression intended. A later example of transformation from the texts is the Historia Augusta's minute description of a vast fresco added to the house of Pompey, depicting a beast hunt given by the elder Gordian at the time of Caracalla, and it could still be seen in the late 4th century, long after the domus had been absorbed into the fisc. Archaeology is not especially helpful in illustrating any of these situations. We have yet to locate the houses of Cicero, Atticus, or Scaurus, and Pompey at San Pietro and Vincoli is just a guess. In cases where houses survive on the ground, we seldom have much evidence of their development over time. Here are some scant traces, starting with an example of lack of change, a fragment of the marble plan depicting the Vicus Patricius along here, and it shows 3 ancient atrium houses whose plan does not seem to have changed much during the 2 centuries between the late Republic, when they were built, and the Severan era in which they were depicted. And out of interest, the enormous atrium you can see the beginning of here on the other side of the road is the one which Filippo Corelli has proposed led up to the house in which the Esquiline Odyssey frescoes were exhibited. And as an example of change, on the left, 2 phases of flooring in the auditorium of Maecenas, representing the original humble monochrome mosaic of its original owner, and the more lavish opus sectial laid during one of its imperial phases. And to the right, a similar repaving, but in late antiquity, from a house near Porta Maggiore that once belonged to the Antonine aristocrat Aufidia Valentilla. It wasn't just the houses of politicians, triumphators, and emperors that attracted attention. Just like today, writers' houses were of particular interest, and thus we know a fair bit about the residences of Horace, Virgil, Martial, Silius Italicus, and Juvenal, to name just a few. This is partly because the authors who provide most of our evidence tend to privilege the houses of their counterparts, that is, fellow writers from earlier times. Fronto, who resided in the Horti Maecenatii in the later 2nd century, calls Horace a famous poet and one with whom I have a connection through Maecenas and my Gardens of Maecenas. According to Martial, Silius Italicus went so far as to buy Cicero's villa in Tusculum and Virgil's tomb in Naples, which he restored. Pliny the Younger tells us that Silius owned several houses in the same district, in each of which he had quantities of books, statues, and portrait busts. The grammaticus Metius Epaphroditus, according to the Byzantine encyclopedia, the Suda, needed 2 houses simply for his library of 30,000 volumes. In some cases, our evidence for such interest in writers' houses extends beyond the purely literary. In the well-preserved 1st century AD Domus at Assisi, which still today goes by the name House of Propertius, there is a fascinating graffito dated precisely to the 23rd of February, 367, saying, "On this day I kissed the house of the Muse, Domum Oscillavi Musae." It's common nowadays to doubt that this really is the house of Propertius. The decor is a little later than the poet, although we know he came from Assisi, and an inscription was found on the site naming 2 members of the Propertian gens who'd repaired the local theatre. Maybe the 4th century visitors were mistaken and they'd come to kiss the wrong house of the Muse. But at least the graffito shows that an interest in venerable personages, and especially writers' houses, was strong in antiquity, and that it extended well beyond the narrow bounds of the literary elite. A nice modern parallel may be found in the mythology built up around the poet Arthur Rimbaud. As is well known, he abandoned his literary career when he was only 21, having already completed the works that made him a legend, and disappeared to the colonies, where he forged a new and anonymous career as a trader in Aden and Ethiopia. Today, you can visit the so-called House of Rimbaud in Harar, a town where the poet really did live, except that this is not, in fact, his house. Although it looks the part, just the kind of colonial mansion that a European trader in coffee and firearms might have inhabited, it was actually built shortly after Rimbaud's death in 1891. The poet's real house was demolished years ago, and tourists have to make do with this one. This leads us to the question of the house museums of my title and the tourist attraction aspect. Obviously, this is a little provocative. I can't pretend that writers' houses in antiquity had exactly the same role as the numerous examples we find today all over the world. Shakespeare and Dickens in England, Keats or Moravia in Rome, as we see here, where you can buy a ticket and endure a guided tour. But it seems clear that in some of our ancient examples, what you might term a heritage mentality existed. The House of Propertius is a particularly intriguing example, but from the sources, we get an idea that some proprietors treated the relics of their earlier venerable occupants in a similar way. Suetonius tells us that Vespasian kept his grandmother's villa at Cosa, where he'd grown up, and I quote, "exactly as it had always been, in an attempt to preserve his childhood memories intact." After their deaths, the houses of Augustus and Livia on the Palatine, if we accept Krause and Corelli's reconstruction, became a memorial, the Ides Caesarum. Corelli believes it was here that Suetonius was able to view various household items from Augustus' residence a century later. The couches and tables, the low bed with its very ordinary coverlet, and his simple woven gowns sewn for him by Livia and Octavia, and note the phrase apparet etiam nunc, as it appears even now. The Ides Caesarum represents the most extreme way of memorializing a house in antiquity, that is, converting it into a temple. The houses of emperors and empresses, as we all know, were often physically replaced after their death with new-built shrines on the same site. Augustus was honored with several house temples. In addition to the Palatine's Ides Caesarum, there was a shrine erected over the house of his birth at the Ox Heads, as we see here in Panella's reconstruction, and also the villa at Nola, where he died. The elusive Templum Novum probably marked the site of his intermediate residence above the ringmaker's stairs in the Forum, where Calvus had once lived. Famously, Domitian took this trope to its ultimate conclusion by building a temple over the house where Vespasian was born on the Quirinal, and then using it in addition as the family mausoleum, the Templum Gentis Flavia. An intriguing reflection of this topic of imperial temple houses, which also offers a clue to the more practical manner of such a foundation, can be seen in this inscription. It represents the permit given by the decurions of Gabii to two Liberti, Polycarpus and Europe, of Domitian's widow, Domitia, who lived on after her husband's murder to a ripe old age and died in around 130 AD, and it allows them to idem faperant, to build an ides. This is stated to be in honorum memoria domus Domitia Augustae, which can be interpreted in two different ways. Pasqualini and Garofalo, in their recent book on Gabii, argue it means domus in the sense of household or gens. Francois Chausson, on the other hand, thinks it might mean that an actual house of Domitia, perhaps the house where she was born, was replaced by an ides or temple. The opposite of memorializing someone through their house, of course, was to efface their memory by demolishing it. We have numerous cases of this from our Republican sources. The houses of supposed pretenders and agitators like Spurius Maelius and Spurius Cassius in the 5th century, Fulvius Flaccus, the friend of the Gracchi, all the way through to Gnaeus Piso and Nero's Domus Aurea. A good modern parallel is Adolphe Thiers' mansion, razed to the ground in 1871 as punishment for his role in suppressing the Paris Commune, as we see here. The most apposite textual reference to this tendency is Dio on Vedius Pollio. When he died in 15 BC, he left his enormous house on the slopes of the Esquiline to Augustus, who, however, had it demolished and replaced with the porticus of Livia. Dio's explanation was that in this way, Pollio would have no mnemosynon monument in the city. Although it's been pointed out that in all of these cases, we paradoxically end up by preserving their owners' names forever in the literary record. Now, all of this is by way of introduction. The well-known topic of houses and memory in Rome, as reflected through the classical sources, and especially the memory of house transmission, the genealogy of real estate, if you like. The bibliography on the subject is considerable, but it might be of interest to students on this year's City of Rome course that the two authorities I found most helpful were in fact former students of our same MA course. For the late antique period, Carlos Machado, now an eminent professor at St. Andrews, and he'll be giving a lecture later in the series, and here we see him in the halcyon days of 2002. And for the earlier Republican period, Brittany Dimone, in the shade here, now in the classics faculty of Calgary University, who wrote an excellent essay in 2014 on remembering the Roman Domus, her notes for which she generously lent me, and which I have shamelessly plagiarized for my introduction. And here she is on the Aurelianic walls 10 years ago. In tonight's lecture, I want to focus on two slightly different facets of the argument. Principally, the Christian version of house memorials, but also the scope in all of this for uncertainty and error in assigning names to houses, especially when property transmissions and the accumulation of names can give rise to confusion. Or conversely, when some owners' names are purposefully or otherwise forgotten. The Christian tradition of house memorials is generally viewed by scholars as a distinct and less trustworthy phenomenon. Although given the commonality of the trope in the wider Roman world, there need be no a priori reason for doubting that Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, like everyone else, would have shown a similar curiosity in notable personages' houses. Despite this, for the early centuries, we have no comparable evidence for any interest in properties associated with Christians. That is, not a single reliable text, a text written prior to the semi-legendary martyr tales of the 5th century, ever associates any of the historical Christian personalities who are known with certainty to have stayed even for brief periods in Rome with any house in the city. This means we hear nothing about where such individuals as St. Paul, St. Ignatius, Justin Martyr, or Saints Numeria and Candida may have resided in the city. This might have something to do with property ownership. Such non-elite Christians would not have owned their houses, although it would be hard to argue that there were absolutely no property-owning Christians in the early centuries. The aristocrats who donated the land for the catacombs, for example, would have owned houses in the city, people like Priscilla, Praetextatus, Syriaca, Commodilla, and so on. But then, from the late 4th and the 5th centuries, we find something of an explosion in interest for marking the sites connected to the martyrs with monuments. Tituli, or titular churches, and the term is also seen as a specific legal designation for an autonomous ecclesiastical institution, start springing up all over the city. There are striking parallels here with what we've just covered. As with Domitian's Gentis Flavia, we see shrines built over tombs, like Augustus at Nola at the sites of their death, and naturally over their houses, although there's nothing in classical antiquity to compare with such monuments as the one in the slide, the titulus fasciolae, built to commemorate the spot where St. Peter's suppurating bandage fell off his leg during his prison outbreak along the Via Appia. The construction of churches over sites believed either at the time or afterwards to have been the residences of saints also means that we have a good deal of archaeological evidence for the buildings that were sealed off, as it were, by the overlying basilicas. This evidence often shows that many, some would even say most, of the tituli churches have falsified or mistaken their chosen sites as genuine memorials of the martyrs. Sometimes we find that a house beneath a martyr church is actually later than the period of said martyr, or even that the remains are not in fact those of a house at all. Such falsification or mistaken identity is also revealed by the text in our slide from the Acts of the Carthage Council of AD 401. This shows that the church authorities tried to enforce the authenticity of such memoria martyrum. In other words, although there was the wish to commemorate genuine sites of interest, it was the case that numerous false memorials were springing up at the time, hence the need for the law. The false memorials needed false authentication, and this was supplied from the 5th century onwards by the Acta Martyrum, or the Passiones, martyr tales, often but not always written with the scope of magnifying the importance of individual buildings or institutions that claim to be associated with the martyr or saint in question. In modern scholarship, these texts have given a bad name to the tradition that the tituli had any genuine connection to the saints to whom they're dedicated. As well as being full of miracle tales and prodigious endurance of horrific tortures, they also include topographical invention or error and even deliberate falsehoods. Saints John and Paul buried in their house on the Caelian, Galla Placidia demolishing a church of St. Lawrence built by Pope Damasus in the garden where she played as a child, and so on. The problem in all of this is how to tell a potentially genuine case from the others, to sift the evidence and attempt to retrieve any reliable data, as well as to try to understand the possible reasons for the errors and falsifications. So, with those goals in mind, let's now have a closer look at the question of the Christian version of houses and memory, or rather memory of past residents, by introducing a specific case study that will allow us to go into some detail on both archaeological evidence and the literary tradition. Regarding the emphasis on uncertainty, this will also show how, in effect, confusion and falsification might themselves obtain a kind of memorial. The 4th century regionary catalogues include a number of named domus, about 10 if we include the private residences of Trajan and Hadrian listed on the Aventine. Others are the Domus Dionis on the Palatine, perhaps that belonging to the historian Cassius Dio, and those of such well-known figures as Fabius Caelo and Cornificius or Cornificia. Among these, there is a Domus Britsi Praesentis situated in Region 3, which has never excited much interest in the topographical literature. The full order of the monuments listed is seen in the slide: Monetum, Amphitheatrum, Ludum Magnum, etc., etc. As we saw yesterday during our visit to Region 3, the buildings closest to the Domus Britsi in this sequence, of them, only the amphitheatre or Colosseum and the Ludus Magnus can be located on the ground with absolute certainty. But we also saw that the Moneta has been plausibly identified with the large storage building beneath the church of San Clemente, just here. And we know from inscriptions that the summum curagium, the scenery depot of the amphitheatre, stood somewhere between San Clemente and the Baths of Trajan, and that the castra misenantium or misenatium, the barracks for the sailors who unfurled the Velaria, was closer to the Colosseum at the beginning of modern Via Labicana. As is generally the case with the regionaries, all of this makes it difficult to explain the exact progression from monument to monument. We seem to jump from the Moneta San Clemente to the amphitheatre before returning to the intermediate Ludus Magnus and Summum Curagium, and then diverting eastwards to the Baths of Trajan and Porticus of Livia. But we can at least be sure that the Domus Britsi Praesentis stood among a group of monuments including the Mint, the Colosseum, and its subsidiary buildings, the Ludus Magnus, Summum Curagium, and Castra Misenantium. And it's this house and its owners that I want to concentrate on. Although not all of the space between the Ludus Magnus and San Clemente is known archaeologically, the only standing remains of a large Roman house are those beneath the apse end of the church of San Clemente. These lie next to the presumed moneta, from which they are divided by a narrow alley. What we have of the building is the subterranean sector of an atrium and its surrounding cryptoporticus, together with rooms opening off on three sides. And this is the building we visited yesterday in Guidobaldi's plan and in Union's fine axonometric reconstruction. Brick stamps found by Federico Guidobaldi in its drain and staircase date the building's original construction to the reign of Domitian. He believes the later part, although none of the stamps gives an absolute chronology. To this first phase belong the mythological stuccos on the vault of some of the rooms and the pumice of the vault of the subterranean space beneath the atrium. The ensemble may have been a summer triclinium or a nymphaeum. In the late 2nd or early 3rd century, the famous Mithraeum was installed. The triclinium nymphaeum became the cult hall, and benches were installed in the end rooms. And to this phase belongs the triforium arch in the central Mithraic antechamber and various frescoes. The large Christian basilica of San Clemente was built at the upper ground floor level towards the end of the 4th century, at which time the Mithraeum was violently destroyed. And in the slide here, we have the basilica's terminus antequem from Jerome's De Viris Illustribus, written in 392, which tells us that a church built at Rome preserves the memory of his name unto this day. And above that is De Rossi's reintegration of what is most likely the original dedication inscription from the pontificate of Siricius, who started to reign in 384. The construction of the church, and here obviously we're looking at the upper church from 1108, but here is the late antique church, would in addition have damaged the above ground upper floors of the domus and necessitated the complete destruction of the moneta next door, whose basement lies beneath the church's nave and aisles. The possible presence of a Christian church or meeting hall in the period before the construction of the basilica, and therefore coexistent with the Mithraeum, whether situated in the domus or in the upper floors of the warehouse, remains an open question. Who might have owned this house? All past attempts to identify the proprietor have been influenced by the fact that nearly 300 years after its construction, the church dedicated to St. Clement was built on the site. Therefore, somebody named Clement, Clemens, whether a genuine saint or not, has been the prime candidate. As soon as the first traces of the Flavian house came to light in the 1860s, Giovanni Battista de Rossi proposed that they belong to the actual house of Pope Clement, who since at least the 3rd century has been identified with the writer of the first letter of Clement, which we see on the left, a genuine early Christian document written in Rome during the reign of Domitian. Richardson's topographical guide follows this identification as recently as the 1990s. But the unlikelihood of a Greek-speaking Christian, whether he was or not the leader of the city's Christian community at the end of the 1st century, living in a new-built aristocratic domus, led the Reverend Lightfoot, a contemporary of de Rossi, to suggest the building belonged instead to the aristocratic Flavius Clemens, the cousin of Domitian. Suetonius, and in far more detail, Cassius Dio, relate that Clemens, together with his wife, Flavia Domitilla, was condemned to death by the emperor, according to Dio, for atheism, a charge on which many others who drifted into Jewish ways were condemned. And we later hear from Suetonius that it was the steward of the same Domitilla, Stephanus, who went on to assassinate Domitian the following year. For a long time, Dio's remark led scholars to suspect that it was, in fact, Christianity and not Judaism to which Clemens and his family converted, although this idea is no longer popular. Lightfoot, in 1890, proposed that the early Christian writer Clement, to whom the church was later dedicated, may have been a slave or freedman within the household of the supposedly Philo-Christian Flavius Clemens, and that we might still legitimately therefore term the Domus the House of Clement. Prosopographers, on the other hand, have pointed out that if this were the case, Clement the Libertus would have received the gens name Flavius and not the cognomen Clemens. Notwithstanding such objections, we'll be returning to this idea, but with the readiness to take into account the possibility that such errors, including topographical errors, might also take place in antiquity. More recent ideas than De Rossi's, influenced by Kirsch's theories on the origin of the early tituli, have conjured up an otherwise unknown Clement who may have owned the property much later in the 3rd or early 4th century. He would have donated it to the church, and so it was his name that later, by the end of the 4th century, became confused with the 1st century saint. This theory, which is the orthodoxy in current bibliography, strikes me as somewhat bizarre. It recalls the joke about how the plays we attribute to William Shakespeare were in fact written by a completely different man with the same name. More plausible, if now largely forgotten, suggestions have been made on the basis of epigraphic evidence from the site. Franz Cumont thought the owner might be a member of the Arian gens due to the pater named on the Mithraeum's altar being one Gnaeus Arius Claudianus. De Rossi and Uniant noted that a dedication to Caracalla was found behind the church in the 17th century, which named a married couple, Rufinus and Lupacilla. Maybe they owned the house, at least in its 3rd century phase. Lastly, arguing from the house's close proximity to the warehouse building or mint, others imagine the domus may have belonged to a state functionary in charge of the moneta. But given the topographical argument I've just advanced regarding the regionary catalogues and the presence of a domus Britzi praesentis in an area that coincides quite closely with San Clemente, I'd like to spend some time looking in more detail at the possibility that what we have here is the self-same house of Britzius, or as the name is more usually given, Brutius Praesens. Who was this man? The standard prosopographies list a number of notable members of the family, dating from the Flavian to the Severan periods. And here, just to give you an idea, don't worry if you can't read all the names. This is the PIR of 1933, which even misses several important newer discoveries, as we'll see. Most prominent amongst this wealth of names are Lucius Brutius Maximus, who was proconsul of Cyprus in AD 80, who had still not been discovered in 1933, and his son, the Praesens addressed in a letter of Pliny the Younger in 107, of whom we'll hear more later. This man was almost certainly the same Gaius Brutius Praesens who was twice consul in around 120, and again at the ripe old age of 70 in 139. And the PIR here has got this individual as 3 different entries. Other members of the family include successive generations of consuls through the Antonine and Severan period, as well as the Crispina, who married Commodus in 178. One of our series of 2nd and 3rd century characters was the same Brutius Praesens mentioned in a Greek inscription from Venosa, where the family owned land, in which his estate manager, or oikonomos, invokes Helios Mithras for the health of his patron. The last recorded member of the family appears in a list of aristocratic priests and philosophers in an inscription of around AD 320, which was once seen in the pavement of San Giovanni in Laterano. Given that the house beneath San Clemente was built under Domitian, any or all of these personages may have been owners. The house could, for example, have been built for the first Bruttius, Lucius Maximus, father of Pliny the Younger's correspondent, and then passed down continuously through the family. Alternatively, the house may have been built for a completely different family during Domitian's reign, and then been bought or otherwise acquired by the Bruzzi Praesentis later, in time for its inclusion in the Regionary catalogues. The fact that most of the other named houses in the Regionaries belong to individuals from the period between Hadrian and Septimius Severus might urge us to seek the first of the Bruttian proprietors among the consuls from 120 to the 180s. In the prosopographical literature on the Bruzzi Praesentis, there is one figure who is seldom included and who has never been linked with the topographical question of the Domus Britzi Praesentis. Furthermore, he has an extremely significant link to the buildings on our site due to the tradition of St. Clement and his namesake, the consul Flavius Clemens. This is the historian Bruttius, whose now lost chronicle was used by Eusebius and Jerome to date the martyrdom of an important relative of Flavius Clemens, as well as other Christians. Bruttius writes that a very large number of Christians achieved martyrdom under Domitian, and among them, Flavia Domitilla, the niece of Flavius Clemens, the consul through his sister, was relegated to the island of Pontia because she affirmed that she was a Christian. In addition to this reference, Eusebius, this is from Eusebius's chronicle as translated into Latin by Jerome, but in his ecclesiastical history, Eusebius says, and I'll just give you the original English, even historians who accepted none of our beliefs indicate the precise date in the 15th year of Domitian, that's 95 AD, that Flavia Domitilla, who was born the child of the sister of Flavius Clemens, one of the consuls at Rome at that time, was exiled to Pontia as a punishment for her witness to Christ. Now, you notice that the name Bruttius is not given here, but the information must come from the same source used in Eusebius's chronicle, and it therefore tells us that Bruttius was a pagan. Bruttius, then, is our earliest explicit source for Christianity in the family of Flavius Clemens, since, as we've seen, Suetonius and Dio are vague on the question, speaking merely of atheism and Jewish beliefs. More specifically, Bruttius, through Eusebius, is absolutely clear that it was not Flavius Clemens who professed Christianity, but his niece. And note also that according to Bruttius, Clemens would have had both a wife and a niece called Flavia Domitilla, which is by no means surprising. What else do we know of Bruttius the historian? He is cited twice more in the form Butzius and Botzius by the 6th century chronicler John Malalas, who, in addition to repeating the Eusebian reference to Domitilla, uses him as a source for the genealogy of Perseus through Zeus, Picus, and Danae, and for Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, as we see here. The chronological range of these references has suggested to scholars that Bruttius had compiled a world chronicle after the form established in the Roman world by Cornelius Nepos, Trogus, and Ampelius. But the fact that, excepting Jerome, who was translating Eusebius, all of our testimonia to Bruttius the historian come from Greek and Syrian followers of Eusebius, people like Malalas, John of Antioch, Syncellus, and Michael the Syrian, should make it clear that his original chronicle was written in Greek. De Rossi points out that since Bruttius is not cited for any event later than Domitian's reign, this gives us a reasonably firm terminus for his floruit. Although it was the common opinion of scholars up to the early 20th century that the writer Bruttius would have belonged to the family of the Bruzzi Praesentis, the link has only been pursued seriously in more recent times by Ronald Syme, who identified him with the best-known member of the family, the correspondent of Pliny the Younger, and the consul of around 120 and 139. Syme argued that Bruttius had composed a history in Greek, continuing Tacitus and supplementing Suetonius, drawing on his own experiences under Domitian. In addition, due to the characteristics ascribed to him in Pliny's letter, where we hear of his jucundissimum genus vitae, his pleasant way of living, and voluptates, the pleasures of his country retreat, he may have been an Epicurean and therefore shown some sympathy towards or interest in the Christians. The more skeptical compilers of the fragments of the Roman historians, on the other hand, whilst not going as far as the conspiracy theories of Geltzer and Pater, who denied Bruttius' existence and suggested he was a confection of Christian historiography, have preferred to cast doubt on the testimonia. For them, starting from the belief that there was no persecution under Domitian, the relevant fragment must be nonsense, composed by a Greek Christian writer, perhaps a Severan emulator of Julius Africanus. If he had any link to the aristocratic Brutii, it could only be in the person of a Greek freedman who was perhaps moved to confect the story of Flavia Domitilla after observing the fate of a more recent imperial woman, the Brutia Crispina, who was daughter of the consul of 180 and wife of Commodus, who was exiled to Capri on a charge of adultery and later put to death. So, according to this somewhat tortuous view, Eusebius would have been lying when he said Bruttius was a pagan, and the supposedly Severan Christian chronicle would have contained nothing worth citing by later Christian authorities after the time of Domitian. Let us then suppose that the same writer of the history, cited by Eusebius and Jerome, gave his name to the Domus Britsi Praesentis of the Regionary catalogues. If, as I've suggested, this was the same house that survives beneath the apse end of the church of San Clemente, we would then have an extremely interesting connection between its late 1st or early 2nd century proprietor and the ancient and modern hagiographical traditions concerning the church's origins. In other words, the church dedicated to Flavius Clement's namesake, Saint Clement, would lie over the house of the very historian who is our sole source for the Christianity of the niece of the same Flavius Clemens and of her condemnation under Domitian. Could there be anything more than coincidence behind such a connection? Two possible answers to this question take us back to our departure point, that is, the Romans' interest in the genealogy of their houses, and especially writers' houses. And here are some ancient faces from the site to accompany our ruminations. The simpler of the two solutions requires no more than we accept that the house of the Brutsi Praesentis had a special significance for the late 4th century builders of the Church of St. Clement. Here, we have Bruttius the historian occupying a large domus dating back to Domitian's era. As with other notable personages of the 2nd and 3rd century, Cornificia, Fabius Chilo, Cassius Dio, Bruttius' name remained associated with the house long after his demise, at least until the Regionary catalogues were drawn up in the mid-4th century. At precisely the same time, Bruttius' history was being read, cited, and used by Christian chronographers to amplify the details of the Domitianic persecution, and especially to confirm the Christianity of the family of Flavius Clemens. For the 4th century Christians who dedicated the Church of St. Clement on this same site, therefore, a link between their titular saint and the pagan writer who appeared to have confirmed his historicity would have been most appropriate, carrying with it just the right amount of archaeological authenticity and at the same time religious triumphalism. The second possibility at first sight seems to require a greater degree of speculation or fantasy. This relates to the prehistory of the Domus Britsi Praesentis. Could it be that the house's original owner was in fact Flavius Clemens himself, as the Reverend Lightfoot proposed in 1890? The writer Bruttius and his family would then have been the later proprietors. He may even have acquired the property immediately after the demise of its original Domitianic builder. As with cases mentioned in our introduction, I'm thinking specifically of Fronto and Horace and Silius Italicus, Bruttius showed an intelligent curiosity in the previous owner of his new residence. He knew the house was built during Domitian's reign for the notable family of the Flavi Clementes, and that it had been the residence of the very consul who, together with his family, had been sent into exile and executed by the tyrant for what Dio would call atheism and Jewish ways, and he even incorporated this information into his own historical work. At this point in our investigation, of course, all of this is mere speculation. We do have reasonable grounds based on topography and archaeology, and perhaps even the link to Mithras, for proposing that the house beneath San Clemente is the Domus Brutsi Praesentis of the Regionary catalogues. But we have no material connection between the actual houses of Brutius Praesens and Flavius Clemens, beyond the perhaps fortuitous coincidence of the texts and the dedication of the church. Whilst this deficiency is true of the two families' urban properties, we can, however, produce some fascinating epigraphic data to link their suburban properties. As is so often the case, the only scholar to have lighted upon this coincidence, and above all its significance for the complex question of the early Christian tradition of St. Clement and Domitilla, as well as Brutius's role in its textual transmission, was Giovanni Battista de Rossi, followed by his student, Marucchi. During his work in the 1850s at the catacombs of Domitilla on the Via Ardeatina, and here we see the slightly later discovery in 1875 of the funerary basilica in a photo from the Parker collection, the pioneering archaeologist identified a small corpus of inscriptions referring to the slave family of Flavia Domitilla Vespasiani Neptis. This would therefore be the wife of Flavius Clemens, not the niece, whose tombs had been granted eius beneficio and ex indulgentia of their patron. The best provenance of these was found during the early 19th century excavations at Tormarancia, the large estate once owned by the Duchess of Chablais that also directly overlies the same catacombs of Domitilla. Here we're looking at the map turned on its side with north up here. So we've got the Via della Sette Chiesa, the Via Ardeatina running along there, and the catacombs will be roughly here. And the other inscriptions most likely originated in the same area or close by. One of them was found in the Vigna Bellotti on the other side of the Via Ardeatina, above the catacombs of San Sebastiano and St. Calixtus. Crucially, for our current inquiry, these same locations, and even in some cases, same excavations, yielded 9 funerary inscriptions of freedmen and freedwomen of the Bruzzi Praesentis. Here are 8 of them, and another was found in 1915 at the catacombs of San Sebastiano. Of these, 2, 7588, if you can find it, and 7582, specifically mention the role of their patrons, Gaius Brutius Praesens, the consul of 153 and 180, and Lucius, the consul of 187, who respectively built and donated land for the tombs of their freedmen. 2 of the inscriptions came to light in the same excavations at Tormarancia that revealed Flavia Domitilla's ex indulgentia kippus, and others were subsequently retrieved by de Rossi himself from the underlying catacombs into which they had apparently fallen. 3 more inscriptions were found on the opposite side of the Via Ardeatina in Vigna Cassini and the catacombs of San Sebastiano, in other words, the same area where Flavia Domitilla's beneficio inscription came to light. The last 2 have a more generic provenance, but 7585 at least was found in 1771 extra Portum Capenum, in other words, somewhere outside the Porta San Sebastiano. What are we to make of this intriguing coincidence in the light of our theory regarding Brutius Praesens' urban residence? All scholars who've studied the epigraphy of Tormarancia have assumed that the relevant funerary areas stood within Praedia belonging to the Flavii and the Bruzzi. The 2 notable villas discovered in the same Chablais excavations, which during the Antonine period may have belonged to Munetia Procula, from which come these wonderful frescoes now in the Vatican, and Numisia Procula, that's the plan of the villa above us, have at one time or another been tied to each of our noble families. Lanciani assumed that both of the villas originally belonged to Flavia Domitilla, and Maria Letizia Caldelli has noted that the owner of the Numisian villa in the 180s may have been a relative of Brutius, the consul of 180. And I should say that other villas are also known in the same extensive Tormarancia zone, but none as yet assigned to any specific proprietor. But whether or not we imagine the 2 families owned villas near the tombs, we can at least be sure, as de Rossi pointed out so long ago, that due to these inscriptions, the Flavii and the Bruzzi most certainly possessed land in the same sector of the Via Ardeatina. It's also worth noting that the Bruzzi inscriptions post-date those of Flavia Domitilla. We might therefore conclude, as I proposed for the urban domus at San Clemente, that the Bruzzi Praesentes had come into possession of the suburban estates of the late 1st century Domitilla, perhaps immediately after the condemnation of Flavius Clemens and his family. The ownership of the estates at Tormerantia provides some corroboration for my hypothesis regarding the urban property. The likelihood that funerary terrain, and perhaps even villas on the Via Ardeatina, passed from the family of Flavia Domitilla to the Bruzzi Praesentes after the family's downfall, helps to buttress the argument that inside the city, a townhouse originally belonging to Flavius Clemens and Domitilla was taken over by the Bruzzi Praesentes following the earlier consul's condemnation. At the end of the 4th century, with the extinction of the Bruzzi Praesentes, the church of San Clemente was built on the site. Again, the synchronicity between urban and suburban site is striking in that, in the latter case, it was beneath the lands of the Bruzzi Praesentes that the Christians excavated the catacombs of Domitilla. The basilicas at both sites were probably built at roughly the same time. Pope Damasus for that of Sts. Petronella, Nereus, and Achilleus at Domitilla on the left, and Pope Siricius for San Clemente. A final striking link between the two sites comes in the form of our funerary inscription naming Flavia Domitilla as Vespasiani Neptis. This was first recorded in the late 16th century, precisely in the upper church of San Clemente, where it had been reused for the steps of the bishop's throne. And its two pieces appear to have been disturbed during Clement XII's works. One of them is now lost, and the one in the slide is in the Hall of the Doves at the Capitoline. This cannot be a coincidence, and at the very least shows that there was clear awareness of the two sites' sacred or historical bonds at the time the upper church was built in 1108. More likely, its original move from Tormerantia would have occurred in the early Middle Ages, and it had been first reused in the lower church before being moved upstairs, together with the beautiful 6th century choir streams. As we've noted, only de Rossi realized the significance of the topographical and epigraphic links between Flavia Domitilla and Bruttius Praesens at Tormerantia for the question of the historicity of Eusebius's claims that the niece of Flavius Clemens was condemned for Christianity. This was because he was in turn alert to the connection between Eusebius's lost pagan source, Bruttius, and the otherwise well-known family of the Bruttius Praesentes. Despite de Rossi's intuitions being repeated by his student Marucci, and in England by Lightfoot, his theory has since been entirely forgotten. De Rossi supposed that the two families, Flavi Clementes and Bruzzi Praesentes, were simply neighbors, and it was this closeness that inspired the latter to include elements regarding his notorious fellow senator in his historical work. Thanks to the urban evidence presented here, I've gone further and imagined not that the two families were neighbors, but rather that one succeeded the other and indeed usurped its estates. The precise circumstances of this property takeover can be elucidated through the biography of the man I have proposed as the most likely candidate as said usurper, the Bruttius Praesens, whose enigmatic chronicle bridges the gap between Flavius Clemens and the Basilica Sancti Clementis. The same man, according to Syme, who was the recipient of Pliny's letter in 107 and twice consul in around 120 and 139. So we'll finish now with his intriguing curriculum or cursus honorum. This was set out in great detail by Charles Picard and refined by Syme on the basis of this inscription, and it provides some fascinating circumstantial data for the trajectory of the property passage sketched in this lecture. The text was discovered in Maktar in North Africa in 1949, where it had been reused in a Byzantine aqueduct after originally being set up to Praesens when he was proconsul of Africa in around 134. And the fragment to the right is from a similar text from Lepsis Magna, noted by Reynolds and Ward Perkins. So we see here, and we work backwards from the end in the traditional Roman format. So starting down in the last line, that after making a brilliant impression as a young military tribune, in Domitian's Bellum Marcomanicum, not Germanicum as integrated here, but Marcomanicum, in 89 AD, when he was perhaps just 20 or 21, and where he was awarded military decorations, Bruttius disappeared from the scene during Trajan's reign and played no part in the Dacian Wars. This interlude, as we know from Pliny, was spent on his country estates in Lucania and Campania. But then suddenly he was recalled to the Eastern Front as legate in 114-5 for the 6th Ferrata Legion in Syria, where he again received military decorations. He was governor of Cilicia in 116, just before Trajan's death in the same province's port city of Selinus in 117, where he would have assisted in Hadrian's assumption of power. It was then during Hadrian's rule that he enjoyed the highest offices. First consulship between 118 and 120, as we now know since the discovery of this inscription, governor of Moesia, and Werner Eck has since located this in 125 AD, followed by diplomatic duties in Cappadocia, and when the inscription was set up, proconsul of Africa. Finally, as we know from the Historia Augusta, he achieved a second consulship at the ripe old age of 70, together with Antoninus Pius in that emperor's first year. This is an exceptionally anomalous career path, as Syme, Picard, and others have noted. Here we have a provincial senator making a glittering debut under Domitian, and then going into virtual early retirement under Trajan, and re-emerging fairly late in life, in his late 40s, to resume his career, 2 consulships and proconsul of Africa under Hadrian. Now, it doesn't take a genius to see that this would fit rather neatly into the picture I presented from the real estate data. That is, the loyal supporter of Domitian, we know that his legion had remained faithful to the emperor in 89 during Saturninus's revolt, was rewarded with the properties of that emperor's condemned enemy, Flavius Clemens, in 95. With the change in circumstances affected by Domitian's murder and the accession of Trajan, the beneficiary of the tyrant's prescriptions would hardly have found any favor. Hence, we see Bruttius retiring from the scene, perhaps drafting his chronicle whilst holed up in Campania with his wife Liberia, who was the daughter of another prominent enemy of the new regime, Liberius Maximus. His fortunes recovered only towards the end of Trajan's reign, perhaps due to the friendship of the young Hadrian. In any case, his reliability during the murky circumstances of Trajan's death in his province of Cilicia assured him of even greater rewards throughout the 120s and after. Finally, the most welcome word in any lecture, there is the question of Pope Saint Clement. In this lecture, I've tried to demonstrate that the church in his name stands over the Domus Brutii Praesentis of the Legionaries, and that this praesens took over the house from the unfortunate Flavius Clemens. But there is absolutely no proof that the Christian writer of the first letter of Clement lived there. The 4th century Christians who chose the site to build the church in the saint's memory were making the understandable error of confusing him, perhaps knowingly, with his namesake, Flavius Clemens. The mistake is already apparent in the picaresque novel known as the Recognitiones, perhaps dating as early as the 3rd century, where St. Clement himself claims that his father Faustus was the emperor's foster brother and his mother a direct relative of the imperial household. By the time of the 5th century Acta Martyrum, illustrated in this 11th century fresco from our site, the process of transformation is complete. Here, there is absolutely no mention of the house of the protagonist, and still less of such a house being replaced by a church after the martyr's death, as in so many other similar tales. Instead, Pope Clement is actually described as the nephew of Clemens the consul. It seems, therefore, that the authentication for our memoria martyrum was not the hero's residence, but rather, to borrow the terminology of our church council ruling, the supposedly fidelissima origine of his pretended historical connection to the original proprietor of what I've called the Domus Brutii Praesentis. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for the masterclass on using obscure textual sources and lost inscriptions and old theories by De Rossi to give a new identity to the house and an important area of the city. Could you say a little bit more maybe about the destruction of the house when they're building the church? In that, do we have any idea on when they're destroying this and then the church is built immediately, or the house is destroyed and then later on there's a phase of abandonment and then the house is built? Or so is it a case of they think this is a significant house, it's demolished, the church is built, or actually the area there's already some damage and it's abandoned and then the church is built?
There's much less evidence for the house in the church phase than the warehouse, because it's only the actual apse of the church that overlies the house. The 4th century church uses the end wall of the domus for its own end wall. There's much more evidence for an intermediate phase in the warehouse, because Federico Guidobaldi noted, and I think Uniont even earlier, noted that there was a strange painted wainscot or dado at the first floor of the warehouse, which predated the church, and it wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a warehouse. So it's possible, therefore, that sometime in the late 3rd or early 4th century, the upper story of the warehouse was being used for something else. But as far as I know, that the house was still okay when they built the church, because the mithraeum, it's something to do with the top. The mithraeum was smashed up in the 4th century, and they used the top of the altar in the pavement of the church, I think it was. So they dated the destruction of the mithraeum to the same period. So that means that presumably the house was still okay until that same period. But it's a bit hard to work out what happened to the demolished upper sections of the house, because it's behind the apse of the church.
Okay. To a reminder of our online audience, you can write questions in the chat. And I'd like to open questions as well to those of us here in the lecture theatre. Well, we've got a couple online to start with. Helen Dixon asks, even if some early church tituli were falsely claimed and some sites of martyrs remained wrongly received verification, and which need to be investigated to ascertain their authenticity, surely the transmitted tradition of tituli has a value of its own. It is just as important for us to know what people in the medieval ages / Renaissance believed the early Christian basilicae were, following up with, i.e., it's just as important for us to know where tradition placed these sites as if they were real.
Oh yes, it's true. I mean, even if it's a lie, it's a genuine lie. Yes, it's certainly the case that some of the early medieval Acta Martyrum claim that their church was built over the house of a martyr, but some of them don't even say that, which makes you think that in those cases certainly there was no house connection, and in the case, as I've done with San Clemente, you have to find what possibly was the other motivation for their choice.
And presumably the physicality of the house doesn't seem to matter either. It's not like they're taking elements of it and moving it up and claiming this is the house of Clement and here is one of his columns or anything.
Certainly not in late antiquity or the Middle Ages. They tend to do that in the Renaissance. The famous the so-called bathroom of Saint Cecilia, where she was decapitated, is sort of created as a chapel in the 16th century, I think, in that church. But yes, I think that idea was more of a Renaissance one.
Okay.
As a medievalist, I know, feel free to jump in on that question. I come from the Dark Ages, therefore this is a question of ignorance, but and it's also two-pronged. So on the one hand, given that from what I understood, this is also a wider phenomenon of sort of looking into being fascinated by the history of who owned the house before. On the secular side, how much of this is about driving up property value? And the other side of the question is actually the more medieval side, because I was thinking of things like you've got very similar things going on in Iceland in the Middle Ages, where people are really obsessed with who owned the farm before them. I wonder how much it might be actually possible to draw a line as opposed to just a comparison between the modern period and sort of poets' houses and the ancient period. And actually, maybe there's continuity. Sorry, that was too...
yeah, I wasn't 100% sure. About property values, I suppose maybe some people have suggested this with the early teacherly, in the sense that a teacher list didn't usually just concern the building of the church, but various sort of appurtenances around it. I suppose, yes, it's possible, therefore, that all of the houses that an individual church owned might be increased in value by the fact that they were associated with a saint, and then people might want to rent them for higher values. Yes, I never considered that, but I'm sure somebody has considered it. The second part of the question, I didn't quite understand.
It was more about the continuity. I was fascinated by this comparison that you drew at the beginning. It was very, very striking. But I wonder whether it's not just a kind of modern phenomenon and ancient phenomenon, but there actually is continuity, because there's obviously the Renaissance fascinated as well. But
fundamental need of humankind, isn't it, to find some tangible connection with
this house was owned by an important person. I'm connected to the important person.
It's the same question that goes into relics and things like that.
Thank you. I have a statistical question. During the Pope Clement, was he in the 1st century?
Yes, the Christian writing.
My question is, in those times, everybody was being persecuted. So how many Christians statistically got away? Because there was a Pope and everything, it was just a curiosity. I mean, because you hear everybody, the martyrs all over. And so maybe 10%, 50%, just maybe you might give us the answer.
No, I've got no idea. As you can imagine, even the question of imperial persecutions of Christians in the early centuries are extremely controversial nowadays. Suetonius tells us that it was the first one under Claudius. The one persecution which even the problematizers accept is Nero's persecution. The Domitianic one is sort of debated, although I can't see any grounds for doubting it. But when you get to the question of numbers, it's really beyond me, I'm afraid.
What do you have to do to get your house named on either Forma Urbis or in the Regio catalogues? Like, why is this house even mentioned in the first place when everything else is public building?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. I think the thing that helps Fabius Kylo is the fact that he's urban prefect when they inscribe the marble plan. So I think his inscription on his house is the biggest actual lettering you'll find on the marble plan. So that's bound to be useful. Why sort of relatively obscure people, but like Cornificia and Philip and various other people are included in, or possibly Cassius Dio in the Regionary catalogues, I have no idea, because obviously these are all later than the Augustan period, and they're earlier than the 4th century. So it might be worth looking in more detail at possible connections between the genesis of the Severa marble plan and some of the monuments, certainly the houses included in the Regionary, sorry, in the Regionary catalogues and the marble plan. But it's something that is worth doing.
I mean, do they act as a toponym in the city, in the sense that it's a place you go and meet by the house of Bruttius? Or
no, I don't think so. Yes, I think, as you said, it might be more of somebody who's considered important in the administration, even in the municipal administration, rather than the popular idea. Because I think if you look at toponyms based on houses in the more popular sphere, such as on slave collars and various other legal restriction things, that they tend to be completely different buildings.
Okay, we have a couple more questions online. Carlos Machado, thank you very much, Robert. This was fantastic as usual. Probably because he got a shout out for his work. I'm interested in the funerary inscription reuse as a step to the Pope's chair in San Clemente. Are there other examples of inscriptions moved from properties in the suburbs to locations related to their owners in Rome? Thanks.
Yes, there's probably thousands of inscriptions moved from the suburbs to the churches in Rome. The problem is always which ones you're going to decide are significant and which aren't. But as you said, the bishop's throne is obviously a notable spot to use a large inscription mentioning Flavia Domitilla, that was confused with the martyr in the medieval tradition. The question for me is whether that inscription was moved earlier than 1108 and was used in the underchurch as well, and why they did it. De Rossi's got a rather bizarre idea that in the 8th century they believed that Flavius Clemens, the consul, was a martyr, and they wanted to get hold of his so-called relics, and they would have moved them to the church along with Flavia Domitilla's inscription, but we have no idea where Flavius Clemens was buried, so that's not going to work either.
Okay, and we have another question from Jan Stud Ostergaard. Does the archaeological evidence from Brucius Praesense's villa in the Sabine country at Monte Calvo enter into your study, sculpture especially?
Unfortunately not. I did check the Bruzi Praesenses, as you saw from the prosopography. There's dozens of them, all very rich, running all the way through the 2nd and 3rd century. And the Sabine villa, I think, is from the Antonine period, although I stand to be corrected. And the brick stamps, for example, which are stamped by the Bruzi Praesentes, are later than my consul. They're from the 150s, 60s, 70s. So that one, unfortunately, is off the table for me.
Do you have any other questions from the floor? If not, everyone is invited upstairs for refreshments. But before we go, can we please thank Robert once again?